everybody, a very warm welcome to all of you. Dr. Arvind Subramanian, Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Dr. Ahluwalia, Chairperson, ICRIER. Speakers and panelists, many of you who have traveled from far. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to warmly welcome you to ICRIER's 9th annual G20 conference, Reimagining Globalization, Views from G20 Countries, being organized in collaboration with our long-standing partners, IMF, World Bank, and the ADBI. We met in August last year at the time of our 8th G20 conference, and we have usually organized our G20 meets in the third quarter of the calendar year, when the weather in Delhi is slightly cooler than 46 degrees that we've been witnessing in the last 2 days. Today, the rain has brought some relief, and hopefully it will stay cooler in Delhi as a celestial reward to our decision to stick with our Paris commitments. This year we meet early in June because the German presidency's Leaders' Summit is scheduled for 7th and 8th of July in Hamburg due to the German elections later this year. I'm really happy to state that the G20 conference of ICRIER has become a permanent and significant feature of our annual calendar. Many of you in the audience have participated in the past, and many of you are participating for the first time. And a warm welcome to all of you, especially those who are participating for the first time. And a warm welcome to everybody to this meeting, and I hope that all of you have a productive meeting. As I said, this meeting has been made possible by established partners who not only contributed financially, but also intellectually in this initiative. We are immensely grateful for their support throughout the planning stages of this conference. Many of you will recall that the 2012 and 2013 conferences resulted in edited volumes that were published by Springer Verlag. Next year, we plan to do a call for papers, and we will attempt another volume closer to India's G20 presidency. Once again, profound thanks to all of you for coming, and without taking too much time, may I invite Dr. Ahluwalia to please chair the inaugural session. Thank you all once again very much.
Dr. Arvind Subramanian and friends, a very good morning and a very warm welcome. I know that Dr. Subramanian has many pressing commitments. It's been very gracious of him
except monetary policy.
to accept our invitation. So I wouldn't say very much, and I'm not going to say much by way of your introduction, Arvind. I have something written here, but everybody knows you. Except to say that these are really very difficult times for the global economy. Not only do we need the Arvind Subramanians of individual countries to get on with the job of improving productivity and deal with aging populations and reduce the high income inequality, but we really need them all to engage with each other so that we can really bring back that faith in globalization. There's enough documented on what globalization has done for the poor of the world, but because of increasing inequality in advanced economies, rising protectionism is coming up, and Brexit and Mr. Trump, I don't need to say anything more. The time is such where we really need to use the more young instruments like G20 to come together. And I'm really very happy that this is the 9th year that we are coming together, bringing officials and policymakers from G20 countries to come together, brainstorm on how to revive globalization, how to get the best out of technology, and really convert these challenges into opportunities. And who better to kick off this conference than Arvind Subramanian, who has seen it from all sides. He has seen it from the IMF, he has seen it from a global think tank perspective, and he's seen it from the perspective of the policy maker, chief policy maker of one of the most promising economies if we are to revive this process. So Arvind, we are all eagerly awaiting to hear you. He's also kindly agreed that after, I don't actually like calling these things addresses, after his remarks, he's going to allow us to engage in Q&A with him. Thank you.
Thank you, Ishar. Thank you, Rajat. It's a great pleasure to be here. One of the really wonderful things about this job is that on Monday, I get to speak about livestock, on Wednesday about monetary policy, and on Thursday about globalization and things. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a lovely, wonderful audience here. I just want to say a few things today, and if I may be permitted to sort of broaden the scope of the title and the scope of the conference, I want to speak about reimagining not just globalization, but also cooperation. I think these are twin and interlinked subjects, and I want to make a few remarks on this. I want to make them under three headings. One is what I would call the kind of big picture kind of evaluation of where we are and where we're headed. Then a little bit about the specifics of today, and finally something about what the opportunities are for India and indeed for everyone else to further this, absolutely essential agenda of furthering cooperation and preserving and fostering globalization as well. So let me begin with the big picture. For whatever it's worth, I wrote a book called Eclipse, talking about rising powers and declining powers. And the day after the US withdrew from or announced it was going to set in motion the process for withdrawing from Paris, I tweeted, I put the cover of my book, which unfortunately I can't put up here. I said that never imagined I would be proved so right so soon for so many nobly structural reasons, but also for so many random reasons. So, and I want to parse that a little bit because I do believe in that. I think it's easy to get carried away by the moment. All the stuff that's happening. And I think one of the cardinal sins that all of us analysts do is to kind of extrapolate the recent past and project that into the future, because I do think it's important to distinguish the random from the nobly structural, and my book was trying to understand the nobly structural, because I think I love the line that, was it Barack Obama's speechwriter who said, history zigzags. There's no kind of arc to history. And I think we're zigzagging a little bit. So, we should see it as a zigzag rather than as some, necessarily a deep and fundamental shift. But I think the structural shift, however, is there, and I think we should be, really be understanding that much better. And the structural shift is that, in my book, it was, the decline of the United States and the emergence of China. And we see, for example, some of that playing out, whether it's now, President Xi Jinping now going to Davos and saying, the mantle of, globalization now is going to be taken forward by us. Or whether it's that amazingly impressive summit where $3 trillion is at the disposal of foreign policy. I'm referring to OBOR. And so there is So in that sense, I kind of provocatively said that, we're moving to a G1 world and that G1 is not the United States. I think it's fair to say that I was not completely right. I think that to say it's a G1 in favor of China, I think is overstating it, because I think there are lots of, vulnerabilities in China. I think, I don't know how that's going to turn out. But to simplistically say that the mantle is going from the declining power to the new power may not quite be right. So in that sense, my eclipse hypothesis was not completely right. I do think there is a sense in which we're kind of moving into some kind of G0-ish kind of world where there is a vacuum of leadership, which always means, of course, that the supply of global public goods will be challenged. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind. How do we keep global public goods, whether it's an open system, whether it's financial stability, whether it's climate change, whether it's tackling terrorism, cyber terrorism. We have to keep in mind that G20 and everything else is finally about cooperation for things that we can't do on our own, but we have to do together. So I think we are in that G0-ish kind of world. I'm not saying it's a G0 or G1, but it is a situation where the supply of global public goods is coming under threat, and I think that's why we need to think very hard about that. So that's my kind of big picture thing. Now coming to the specifics of today, keeping in mind what I said about cooperation and global public goods. I have a concrete proposal now for the G20 and what's happening now. I want to make that before I make that, I want to tell you a story that maybe all of you know. Von Hayek, when he received the Nobel Prize, the night before he gave her a banquet lecture, and he said something I think amazingly insightful. He said that economics is a discipline that is very funny because once economists win Nobel Prizes, somehow this conferring of the Nobel Prize gives them, or they think it gives them a legitimacy to speak about all kinds of public policy issues. And he said that's very dangerous. A scientist who's done work on black holes, we probably would not take him seriously if he talks about livestock in India, but for economists that's not the case. So he said all economists should take a kind of Hippocratic oath that I will not speak on subjects in public beyond my core sphere of competence. Why do I say that? I think there is something analogous here with the G20. I think that the G20 should be about cooperation in the service of global public goods. In the last, 9? That means we've had, how many G20s have we had? 15. I think the amount of mission creep that's happened under the G20 is, extraordinary and laughably extraordinary. I think we need to take stock and say, enough is enough. This is not about mission creep. And we go around giving all kinds of policy advice about sunset clauses and not wanting to do mission creep. But I think it is time for the G20 today to step back and say, what is it that we have to do which requires cooperation? What is it that we don't need to do? G20 has no business to be in things like, medium term, whatever. What finance is this finance, the kind of stuff that we do, microfinance, for example. That's a good example. Why the hell should the G20 be doing microfinance? And if you look at the G20 communiques, the list of things that should not be done far exceeds the list of things that can be done cooperatively. So I would urge India and others to say, and remember, in this sense, Trump offers an opportunity. This natural inclination that, we don't want to cooperate, there is some truth in that. There is some merit in that argument that maybe, we've taken this too far, and it's a natural time, and there is an opportunity to scale back on the things that don't need to be done. Now, I don't want to be destructive or flippant. Remember, I do think that the G20 did a phenomenal job, the peak in April 2009, when it did address global cooperation, the crisis situation. And I do think that cooperation at times of crises will be forthcoming. And the G20 is a good forum for that. So now I don't mean to be flippant, and I'm trying to be glib here, but remember, so I have a constructive proposal on conceptually what the G20 ought to be. It ought to be a forum for crisis management, crisis prevention, and I think it's proven that it can do that. But outside of those times, I think what the G20 should be is something that thinks hard and forward about not just current issues of global public goods, but likely future, to think about where, threats to the world are going to come from, and to be a kind of really thinking ahead about issues which will require global cooperation. So the G20 conceptually, out of microfinance, out of universal basic income, whatever you want to say, focused entirely during crisis times, which cooperation, crisis management, and outside of it, just thinking hard about providing, anticipating, identifying crises which will require cooperation, focusing a lot more on global public goods. That's what I think the G20 should be about. Now, just to give some examples of, forward-looking stuff on this, cybersecurity, I think the G20 is doing that already, but I think this is truly a global collective threat. I think we should do more on that. It's something that the UK took up, I think, about a year ago. The whole question of how do companies layer themselves and avoid all kinds of national regulation, tax, competition, the whole Virgin Island kind of phenomenon, the Panama Papers kind of phenomenon. I don't think we understand this really, how companies do this by layer. I think the whole layering of corporate organization, which makes these things so difficult to, go after in any meaningful way. I mean, even in India, I think we have this problem, but I think world over we have this problem. I think that would be another example where I think much more work could be done. I'm not imaginative enough to think of all the things. I'm giving some illustrative examples. The third area, which I think from an Indian point of view, I think could be very important, is water. How do we get, international cooperation on kind of water, which is going to be a major threat going forward? I mean, I recognize that for many countries, it's kind of a regional issue, a bilateral issue, but how can India kind of multilateralize that? And I think that's something that would be worth thinking about. It's objectively very important. And last point I would say on this is, of course, on climate change. I think you alluded to that, Rajat alluded to that, I think. I actually am on this much less worried than, the early indications about, the pullout of the US is. I mean, for a number of very important but, obvious reasons. I think there is a kind of emerging global consensus, at the level of states, at the level of NGOs, at the level of decentralized structures. Even look at what the cities in the United States are doing. I think the cities in China, now maybe the cities in India, I think this has become, it has permeated too deep, thankfully, for any one or other actor to be able to derail it in any significant, substantial way. So, and of course here, I think that India has, I think, played a very valuable role. I think the whole Prime Minister's push for renewable energy and the fact that, we seem to be now an integral part of and crucial to these things going forward, I think is really a big change from the past, a wonderful change from the past, and I think we should continue on this path because climate change is one of the great challenges confronting humanity. So one, a G0-ish world, thinking harder about supplying public goods. Two, what the G20 should be, and as important, what it should not be. I think we should be very careful and clear about. Now I come to my third point about globalization. I'm speaking here now more from an Indian perspective. This is something I've said often before. I think that we in India have now a much bigger growing stake in ensuring that world markets remain open, that we continue to see globalization, at least, at the very least, any reversal of globalization is something that we should be very, very anxious and worried about, because it is, if we want 8 to 10% growth, I think, we need open markets, and I think we need to, push that agenda with the kind of leadership we have shown on climate change, for example. That's point number one. Point number two, I think that, one consequence of the whole what's happening in the United States and the fact that these mega regionals are now in retreat, I think is an opportunity for all of us. Especially for India. We were going to be out of these mega regionals. Our mindset was, oh my God, what do we do about that? That's not going to happen, or at least not as quickly as we thought, or maybe not even. I think that gives us an opportunity to see whether we can, I think, push this, the globalization agenda in all kinds of forums. I think, for example, regional mechanisms, but I do think that this is an opportunity for us to try and revive multilateralism as well. I think this is really an opportunity to do that. I've written on this. I think this is something that I feel that's the case because we have a vacuum on the regional front. I don't believe that the alternative, the self-styled, mantle bearers of globalization have the capacity to do that. And you know who I'm referring to. I think that, I don't think China is in a position to supply the global public good of open markets because, it's not as open an economy in many ways as some of the other open economies have been in the past that have donned this mantle. So I think there is a vacuum created by what's happening from across the Atlantic. I think the alternative is I don't believe at this stage we're ready for that, or even the mantle bearer is itself ready for it. So this opens up the space, I think, for multilateral cooperation on trade by a bunch of what I call, middle-income countries, such as India, which both have the stake and now the ability to kind of don this mantle. I think, for example, a coalition of middle-income countries, led by India, or at least, where India is taking charge, would be, I think, something that we should seriously explore and revive multilateral processes. This does not preclude, for example, India to try and use other mechanisms like free trade agreements with the European Union, for example, to pursue such things as well. To me, one of the more intriguing things about India, which I don't know whether we're right for or not, it's what Mexico did with NAFTA and China did with the WTO. Can international anchors be mechanisms for pursuing domestic reform. It's something that India has never done, but the question is whether, given the state of our economy, given the challenges, given the reforms we need to undertake, do we think that this could be feasible is something that we need to think much more carefully about. But I think this is my last point, and I'll end, I've bored you enough. I will say that, you know, this initiative, effort on our part and like-minded middle-income countries to keep open global markets, especially by reviving multilateralism, is not a free lunch. I think that one thing we have to realize is that we are now important players. We're no longer price takers. We may not be price makers, but we're somewhere in between. We're no longer price takers. So we cannot say, you know, the burden of keeping it open rests exclusively on others. I think we do have, you know, if we want to keep markets open, there is a kind of quasi-noblesse oblige that, you know, some kind of wielding power and influence entails responsibility, but it shouldn't be seen as responsibility because in some ways that I think could increasingly coincide with our domestic interests. You know, we want to open markets, we want to embrace globalization, so why not make a kind of virtue of necessity and say, you know, use this moment in time when we need to reform and open up our economy. You know, we've done a lot on FDI and other areas. I think we need to do more. Why not use this and combine this with our international objectives, the objectives of the global, keeping the global system open, which is a kind of public good. And, you know, we could become players more and more in supplying global public goods. I think that is a foreign policy objective of ours. I think, you know, we're slowly acquiring the economic resources to do that, but I think that, you know, this is a great opportunity. Of course, it goes without saying that all of this requires us to be strong economically, domestically, and as Vijay Kelkar always says, no better foreign policy than 8 to 10% growth, and that agenda should, of course, continue. I bored you enough. Thank you very much for your time. Happy to take questions.
I now invite questions, and I'll request you to introduce yourself.
Nivedita, German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Thank you very much for a very lively and interesting presentation. The mood this morning over coffee seemed to be relatively skeptical. When I listen to you, the mood becomes much more optimistic. Maybe this is a time for a revitalization of multilateralism. Unexpected side effects of US policy, but that might be something we can observe. I have two questions. One is on your criticism of the G20's mission creep. Do you see that as a sign of a weakness of the G20 rather than a strength? And then the second question, I don't dare to use the term monetary policy because I think you have had an interesting week on that, but when you look at crisis management in the G20, you were relatively positive. You said crisis management of the G20 was by and large useful, and we managed to avoid a big kind of controversy and so on and so forth. Is that also true for monetary policy from an Indian perspective? Is that ultra-loose monetary policy that continues to be applied, isn't that an issue? And final question, isn't it problematic that the G20 countries cannot agree on some kind of moderate coordination of monetary policy to avoid side effects, for instance, in the emerging world? Thank you.
Thank you, Ishwar. So Arvind, I take your first and third point quite well, and I have a very strong disagreement on the second issue about the effectiveness of the G20. You said the results are not great and there's a mission creep. I really think it's the opposite. And let me just give you a couple of examples in addition to the one that you mentioned. So let me talk about three, just mention. One is the global regulatory reform agenda has really gone extremely well via the FSB. a second one, which was in the papers yesterday, that related to tax avoidance treaty among 70 countries, not the US, of course. And then the third one is on the issue of financial stability. There's a huge agenda on macroprudential policies. I think these are three very good examples. You noted that the G20 ought to focus on crisis management and prevention. I think what the G20 is doing is very much focused on the latter through promoting good policies and building of institutions, and a lot of progress has been made. So I'd like you to convince me on that second point still.
Yeah, I'll take maybe two more, and then Amar.
Yeah, to carry on a little bit of disagreement, to have a discussion. So when the G20 was formed in 2009, there were three issues on the table: global macroeconomic cooperation, reforming financial regulation, and reform of the international financial institutions. And on global macroeconomic cooperation, as you said, Arvind, the score was probably an A and slipped gradually to a C minus. On financial regulation has been, as Ratna pointed out, an under-recognized area of performance. And on IFI governance, similarly, it started very reasonably good, but has slipped into less performance. Now let's take the mission creep, as you say. So what are the new issues that have come on the table? It has been international tax cooperation, the BEPS initiative in particular, climate change, energy and climate, trade and open markets, and most recently, migration. All of those are quintessentially the kind of public goods that you would point to. And I would say we are struggling on them, but I think they are important issues to be on the table. The list of the G20 is very, very long when you look at the annex, but I would not confuse that with the attention time within the G20. So I'm less persuaded that there is really a huge fragmentation of issues. Even in this G20, the struggles that are going on are centered around really the key issues. And with mixed progress, because it's not just the US that doesn't play ball, it's also others.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you. My name is Wolfgang Hornig. I'm from the German Embassy, financial counselor. And I absolutely agree what has been said before, that by the audience before, and not what you said, Mr. Subramanian. Because there was some criticism on the huge agenda of G20, but this agenda reflects what is going on in the world. So, but I want only to raise one small question to your side. What do you expect, or what do you wish as an outcome from the Hamburg summit in July, from an Indian perspective? Thank you.
Suman Berry.
Thank you, Isha, and thank you, Arvind. Provocative as always. Two quick points. One is, and we do have Montek, the former Sherpa, in the audience. Everybody is talking about the escalation from the G20 at the finance ministers level to the leaders summit. Okay, that's what took place in 2008 and had its high water mark in 2009. So I'd appreciate your reflections and reflections of others on, as it were, the division of labor between the two fora, and to really ask the question, since you've raised the issue of mission creep, whether we would have been better off with more occasional leader summits and for the focus to have remained with the central bank governors and ministers, and many of the achievements that have been cited by Ratna, amongst others, have really been brokered, BEPS, etc., at that level. Secondly, I'd appreciate your views on whether there should or should not be any links between the G20 agenda and the SDGs? Are these ships that pass in the night? Is there any conceptual linkage you would see between those? And my final point would be, one of the issues that the Trump presidency has brought into sharp focus is, as it were, bilateral rather than multilateral clearing, the focus on bilateral trade imbalances, etc. So is this an issue that could be taken up at the G20 as an important part of the return to the kind of global order that was so successful?
Thank you. I think, Arvind, at this stage, you can take these 5. I have recognized some hands at the back. I'll come to you in the second round.
Great. Thanks for all those questions, and also things that for pointing out all these successes of the G20. Let me just take them in order. Is it because of weakness, or But of course, people are challenging that thing. So some would say, no, this is a sign of success. It's a strength of the G20, and therefore, so I think the answer to that will be related to my own assessment of whether I think. I do think that I think maybe what I'm railing against, and remember, this is a highly biased sample of insiders who only see all the weeds and all the great things that are happening. If you stepped outside and say what is it about this that affects people there, and is it resonating in the public consciousness? I would be hard pressed to, but I'll come to the details in just a second. On the ultra-loose monetary policy, I've always had a difference of view on this than Raghu did, for example. And I'll tell you what, of course, now it's becoming more and more moot, and I think that, the US is kind of trying to get out. Europe, maybe it's a matter of time. I don't know what's happening in Japan. But my view always was the following, that one, countries are going to undertake monetary policy in their own interest, point number 1. Point number 2, nobody's told India or Brazil or whatever to open up their capital accounts as rapidly as they did. So, it's a version of you own it, you break it, you own it. I mean, you do it, you expose yourself to the consequences. Then don't start whining about, what other countries are doing in their interest. Point number 3, I think, to be fair to the United States, especially to the Fed in the aftermath of the crisis, remember that, on the one hand, obviously, monetary policy is almost exclusively devoted to achieving domestic objectives. But I think they did take their international responsibility seriously, because if you remember, after 2008, the Fed provided all this liquidity for a whole bunch of emerging market countries. And so I thought that was a nice balance between saying, and remember the irony, countries that would never have been kicked, dragging and screaming, would never go to the IMF, were happy to go and borrow from the US Fed. So in that sense, I think there was but above all, I think that, you open your capital account, you expose yourself to capital flows. I mean, you live with it. You have to deal with those consequences. And so I don't have, I do think a little bit more cooperation may be necessary, but I do not think fundamentally that we should expect other countries to undertake policies, privileging international objectives over domestic objectives. We don't set monetary policy based on the impact of Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. I mean, it's true that a global hegemon has maybe a few more international responsibilities, but I think to some extent they did discharge them, with a reasonable sense of what the international system needed. So that's on ultra-loose monetary policy. Now, coming to this whole set of issues on, has there been successful cooperation or not? Look, maybe, so let me try a kind of my own technical answer and then a broader picture answer. I mean, for one, I think Amar graded it, not me. Macro cooperation slipped. Reform of the IFIs, let's face it, has slipped considerably, and Amar has been in the forefront of that. And maybe there have been successes like BEPS and financial regulation, etc. Now, remember that macro coordination did not require a new institution. I mean, the IMF was always there to do macro coordination. I mean, that's what the IMF was set up for. Similarly, financial stuff, we always had an FSB, and there was no reason why we couldn't give an impetus to that, political impetus to do all the things. I mean, in my view, there was no need necessarily to create a kind of a whole new apparatus and structure to do all these other things. And so in that sense, therefore, well, maybe I'm underestimating some of the successes, but I wonder how successful they've been, and B, it was not obvious to me at all. It's still not obvious to me that you needed these kind of forums to create new forums to do that. Now, but on the other hand, the whole SDG agenda and stuff, the whole development agenda, I think there has been a lot of mission creep. I mean, I remember 4 or 5 G20s ago, I mean, I was just appalled at the agenda, appalled at the kinds of things that were on the agenda. And those things are a combination of weakness, bureaucratic inertia, and of no question, let's be clear, that, whatever, existence creating its own demand. I mean, this whole thing was happening. And I think, so even if I've exaggerated a little bit, maybe, I mean, there's still no reason why we shouldn't take stock and say, what are the things that really require this global cooperation, new mechanism as opposed to what exists already? And I think we need to, but see, no one even asks that question. We say, okay, next summit, someone and his uncle says today something is important that gets added on. So where is the internal check for stopping this? Maybe I should qualify a little bit by saying that what we need is honest periodic review of what is important and what can get done, which are truly cooperative, and what cannot. So I think that's kind of broadly my take on this. On Hamburg, I mean, for us, I think it's consistent with what I said. I think the whole, making sure that, the whole open market agenda is there. I think it's absolutely critical for us. We always have an interest, of course, in the labor mobility issue, and I think so. Keeping trade and labor markets open is very high on the agenda. Suman, I mean, finance to head, I mean, these are all things that I don't know enough about in terms of, who should meet when. But it's certainly true. One of the things that's certainly true is that we don't need so many summit meetings. I mean, we can start with that as mission creep. I don't see why, all 20 major leaders twice a year, I mean, when there's not much actually to discuss. I mean, if there is, I mean, maybe we should do it on a case-by-case basis. Someone takes a call, everything, is it important enough to raise it at that level? But I do think this is part of the mission creep that I'm talking about. Bilateral deficits, I do think that we are getting into, unfortunate territory where, macroeconomically doubtful concepts are creeping into, international economic policy and international trade policy. And I think it would be, not that I think it's going to convince anyone, in the United States that, bilateral trade deficits don't matter and, it's all about savings and investment and so on. But I think that, it's something that the IMF has always been doing. I think we can give that maybe more of a push. And I think that might be worth doing, absolutely.
Dr. Reddy?
I just thought that sort of, if you look at the G20, G20 existed pre-crisis. It was elevated to the level of prime ministers. So we had G20 pre-crisis. It had one way of functioning. Then we had a crisis. It responded. Exit from the crisis, reform. In each phase, the objective circumstances also influence its functioning. Pre-crisis, I don't know what they did. Then the crisis happened. But I know one thing. I was a deputy for some time. There used to be deputies' meetings, very active. Lunchtime, however, there were 2 separate dining rooms, one for deputy governors and the other for finance secretaries. Separate. Lunch used to be in separate rooms. Okay. So that's the coordination before crisis. Now we come to crisis. At crisis, I'm not surprised that there was coordination because all interests were converging. Central banks wanted the same thing, governments wanted the same thing, financial markets wanted the same thing. So it was not a surprise whether it is enabled, how much difference it made, it's a matter of conjecture. Comes exit, necessarily problems, because initial conditions are different, and therefore the recovery had to be uneven, the responses had to be very different, and further, the interests diverged. The financial markets would like to postpone, the central banks would like to advance the exit, the governments would like to do what depends on the circumstance. So therefore, I'm not surprised that there's not much of a coordination exit because it's inherent in the nature of objective circumstances. Then comes the reform. So I think it'll be wonderful for us to prepare a table and see what was the world in 2007 and what's the world in 2017, how much difference has happened, and how much will happen between now and 2027. So I think so if we look at not only what the G20 is doing, but what the rest of the world impacts the way G20 can happen. Thank you very much.
I take that as actually a resounding endorsement of what I said, actually.
There was a hand at the back. Can I? Yes, please.
Good morning, Mr. Subramanian. I'm Nivedita Mukherjee, Additional Director in the International Division of FICCI. I have two questions, sir. You talked of, crisis management. Don't you think the, food security is an issue which calls for a bit of crisis management from the G20? And what do you think is the way ahead for countries to really pool in their efforts on an issue which is really becoming quite big? In the domestic context, we are seeing a lot of agrarian unrest in India. And, there is apparently a no from RBI on the farm loan waiver thing. So where are we heading in terms of food security in India, given that livelihood of farmers is a very intrinsic part of it?
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for your very intriguing remarks. My name is Axel Berger. I'm from the German Development Institute. My institute was involved in the T20 process of think tanks during this year's G20 presidency. Obviously, I was very intrigued by your remarks on the topics which should be on the G20 agenda, which should not be on the G20 agenda. And so one possibility or one mechanism to really check what the G20 should do and where it has a comparative advantage would be an effective and credible accountability framework. I think this is something the G20 should actually work on and develop a coherent accountability framework, which could also help to check where the G20 can be successful and where it should withdraw. I have two questions. I find it very interesting, your remarks on multilateralism. So what would be the issues or issue areas where India has an interest to engage with other middle-income countries to foster multilateral cooperation? That's the first question. Second question, also very interesting, your remarks on importing international pressure to foster domestic reforms. You referred to NAFTA, you referred to the WTO accession of China. So what would be the negotiations India should engage in order to import these external pressures to foster domestic reforms? Is it really the EU-India FTA? Could it be TISA? What's your opinion?
Dr. Kirit Parikh.
You talked about agenda creep, and yet you suggested, which I consider is a largely bilateral issue of water as something that G20 can handle. It seems to me that this is an issue which is largely bilateral, And as we have seen in our country itself, that transferring water from Punjab to Haryana causes a problem. Inter-basin water transfer is hanging in fire for years, maybe decades, you could say. And I think I cannot imagine transferring water from one country to another on a large-scale basis. So how would internationalizing this issue would make a difference in solving water? Our water problems, the solutions lies largely with ourselves, with our own policies.
Yeah, all of these, yeah. Great. Terrific questions. More seriously, I think, Governor Reddy, I think what you said is essentially, I think really consistent. What I'm saying is that structurally cooperation becomes natural during times of crises, becomes very difficult outside, and yet I think my point was that the G20 has not recognized that. And that's the basic point. And we need mechanisms exactly for that collective self-reflection, and including assessing mission creep, accountability frameworks. Remember, there's no such thing as an accountability from outside the system. It's all us doing it internally, and therefore I think I take that. Now, on the food security, it's a very nice question. When the 2007, 8, 9 food crisis happened, I think Aditya Mattu and I wrote, and I think several others wrote as well, that was a moment for international cooperation, because remember that many countries responded to that by imposing export restrictions. And the argument we made was that if every country does that, then you could end up, kind of exacerbating the problem at the global level. Therefore, I think we needed cooperation to see what were better instruments for meeting that than unilateral actions which could be collectively kind of counterproductive. So it's a great example of, in fact, an area where we could have had more cooperation, but then again, that could have been done either under the G20 or under the WTO. Where it's done is less important, the fact that it was a very ripe issue for international cooperation because of the spillover effects of one country's policies on the other. I think on agrarian unrest, this is a forum for international cooperation. I think all of you are welcome to read. I gave a Foundation Day lecture at the National Academy of Agricultural Sciences on Monday. I think, in fact, some of these issues are addressed there. Now, in terms of multilateralism, what would be the issues, what would be the importing mechanisms? On importing mechanisms, I would say all of the above. Whether it's TISA or EU FTA, these can become mechanisms for India's internal reform as well. So, I would say these are not mutually exclusive. I think we should consider all of them. Now, but I want to link the last 2 points. I said, I recognize that water is a completely bilateral issue. Not complete, it is a bilateral issue. But I was hoping, for example, to provoke Shyam Saran and others into thinking more about this, kind of in a geopolitical sense. And let me give the analogy. I think labor mobility is finally also a bilateral issue. Right? It's much easier to do labor mobility bilaterally than it is to do multilaterally, because it's a lot about, in a sense, Aditya Mattu have argued that, for example, it's easier because maybe the receiving country wants to impose some obligations on the sending country, so it's much easier to do it in a bilateral framework. However, we do have the Mode 4 process in the WTO, and I think that maybe what multilateral processes can do here is kind of create the norms and standards that can then inform kind of, even bilateral negotiations. Remember, I worry a lot about water in India because, we are downstream from a major power which controls water. And I just worry that, if it were completely bilateral, would it be easy for us to solve that problem just in that framework? Or can we get norms, international norms of behavior on this, that might facilitate the process. And the analogy is with labor mobility. That's why recognizing that it's bilateral, I do think we may perhaps from a geopolitical sense, from an agrarian sense, we need to think, I think, much more about this. And hence, that's why I provocatively said, can we think about, what are the things that we can do multilaterally, even though, water flows from A to B. Yeah, please.
Yes.
Thank you, Arvind. My name is Ravi Chaudhary. I think you pointed out the key word, cooperation. Now, the problem that we see is that the cooperation requires give and take. Taking is easier, giving is difficult. It calls for a sense of sacrifice. In a political body, G20 is primarily political. In a political body, sacrifice is not accepted as a normal leadership behavior. Now, do you foresee a situation where the problems that we talked about are handled by G20 in a depoliticized environment?
Yeah, so see, I actually, you can never depoliticize. It is, totally political. But let me say three reasons why I kind of disagree with you. One is that, this give often can be in your own interest. For example, at least in terms of, trade reform and so on. I think, we get others to open their markets, we get open ours in return. That's not necessarily a give. I think it could be enhancing for the country, welfare enhancing for the country. Second, we know that during crises, people do develop this sense of collective responsibility, and cooperation does happen. But true, in an extreme crisis when suddenly everything is at stake. I think the third thing is that, if you think about, this is especially true for hegemons, for example, I think that hegemons make this calculation, they think that the give it may not be immediately beneficial, but over the medium-term horizon, it is in fact, that's why we call it kind of enlightened, enlightened self-interest at stake. You may give now, but you come back and get a lot over a period of time, and that's what imbued all our post-war institutions. That the hegemon did say, we had a horrendous experience in the 30s. I think it was ruinous for all of us collectively. So can we do it in a way that may immediately entail costs, but in the long run? And as Suman referred to, we've had 45 years of an open system prosperity, of which the biggest beneficiaries, let's remind ourselves, were the emerging market countries and the early industrializers, including, of course, the whole Korea, Japan, Taiwan period, then China, and now India. I don't need to remind all of you that our period of highest growth coincided with our period of really rapid exports.
Ashima Goyal from IGIDR. You made the interesting statement that nobody asked emerging markets to open their capital accounts. And therefore, if you do that, you need to bear the costs. But in a way, it is the borrower countries that have to bear all these costs. There are costs of capital controls. They increase your cost of borrowing, et cetera, et cetera. So if you have a global system where lender countries also borrow, share some of the costs, so you have regulations that reduce the volatility of capital flows, then that could be more even. It's asymmetric costs in this way. If all the responsibility to deal with volatile flows is on borrower countries.
I can't, my understanding is that, you open your account, the IMF always taught us that, this should be conditional on the strength of domestic regulatory institutions. And that's the calculation we had to make. I think, I can't easily think of examples, and maybe, I've not thought about it enough, of saying that, I open my capital account, whatever institutions, whatever, but you create institutions that will help me bear the cost. I think that's, maybe it can be done, but I think that the predominant responsibility is with this. And as I said, I think the hegemon did behave reasonably in terms of, what it did, at least during the crisis, to kind of share some of that cost. I think, let me say that the overwhelming responsibility for managing capital flows is with the country receiving it. To some extent, maybe it's the others, and maybe to that extent, we do need some cooperation.
And the very last question at the end there.
Yeah, Mr. Subramanian, after this quitting of this US from Paris Agreement, do you think this is G20 will be the next most powerful platform?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think that we're so kind of steeped in this moment in history. There is a future. History zigzags. There will be life after 2020. There is going to be a world after 2020. I think we shouldn't let the here and the now and the proximate too deeply affect our sense of what's possible and what's going to happen. And I do think, as I've said, I think there are opportunities in this, I think, which we should take advantage of. In response to the said about the coffee gloom and this, I think that there's a kind of Dalai Lama principle, which is, try and make good news out of any bad news. So I think to the extent that I've been tried to convey that, I think, we should kind of act on that. Thank you very much.
Well, on that note, let me say a big thank you to Dr. Subramanian. And we now break for coffee.